my mother used to tell us about the famine and the people, all the people died because there were no potatoes. Well, of course, I don't think you'd die. You'd die if you had no potatoes. I think the England were in some collusion over the potato famine and the getting rid of the Irish people from their lands, you see.
As with many great disasters in human affairs, there was no unmistakable signal that this one was at hand. It had been a hot, fine summer, but there was a sudden break in the weather at the beginning of August 1845, with showers of sleet, thunder and lightning, and heavy rain. Reports from counties Galway and Mayo spoke of potato crops of the most luxuriant character, promising abundant yield, and the Freeman's Journal said that the growth of the potato plant was progressing as favourably as the most sanguine farmer could wish. Then, on the 11th of September 1845,
we regret to have to state that we've had communications from more than one well-informed correspondent announcing the fact of what is called cholera in potatoes in Ireland, especially in the north. In one instance, the party had been digging potatoes, the finest he'd ever seen, from a particular field and a particular ridge of that field up to Monday last. And on digging in the same ridge on Tuesday, found the tubers all blasted and unfit for the use of man or beast.
why was this such particularly disastrous news for Ireland? Well, because 1/3 of the entire population of Ireland depended wholly on the potato for survival. The Irish small farmer did, of course, grow cereal crops, but records of the time show that almost all these crops, and sometimes all of them, went to pay his rent. He lived off his potato crop, so that even at the best of times, life was a struggle. It had been increasingly a struggle in the past 40 years because during that time, the population of Ireland had doubled from 4 to 8 million. The pressure on land became absolutely desperate as it was divided into smaller and smaller plots on which the numbers of those depending wholly on the potato grew larger and larger. The poorest of all simply hired out their labor, not for money at all, but in return for a plot on which they could grow potatoes. There was hope at first that some of the potato crop could be saved. But in the first week of October 1845, the Cork Southern Reporter declared,
"The hopes entertained by many appear to be delusive. The potato is apparently sound when dug, but on examination, small round spots are found running round the tuber and having each the appearance of a running sore or cancer. The potato in this state will within a few days be completely destroyed."
It was the spread of the disease in the west that was most serious. The most ominous report of all being from County Mayo in the extreme west, where 9/10 of the population depended on the potato for survival.
All other feelings must give way before the paramount obligation of endeavoring to avert the famine with which the poorer class of this country are now threatened. It would be criminal to refrain any longer from demanding of the government active measures for the protection of the lives of the people.
No one can say that only historical hindsight enables you to see what was about to happen. People in Ireland then could see what was coming all right. So what would the government in London do? Well, the Prime Minister of the day was Sir Robert Kee. It was once said of him that he had a smile like the brass plate on the lid of a coffin. He said he did find the reports from Ireland alarming. On the other hand, he said, one must remember that the Irish had a terrible tendency to exaggerate. But Peel was a conscientious Prime Minister, and he did a number of things. He appointed a special scientific commission of inquiry. He imported from America a large supply of maize, or Indian corn, which was to be stored in government depots in Ireland. And most important of all, he set up in Dublin a relief commission, which was to work with local committees of landlords and others who were coming together all over the country to try and alleviate the distress. These committees started public works such as road building, on which people could earn the money to buy food. And Peel's government gave money grants to match whatever the local committees could raise themselves. So, you can't say that Peel did nothing. Another thing he did was to try and lower the price of bread by repealing the import duties on corn, which were known as the Corn Laws, something which, in English terms, was a big decision. But lowering the price of bread in Ireland was actually of little use to people there. 1/3 of the Irish population could hardly afford bread at any price. That was precisely why they lived off potatoes. All government policy of that day was guided by the almost sacred principles of something called political economy. The chief argument of this was that you should interfere to the absolute minimum with the free market forces of supply and demand, which was the only healthy and effective way of supplying needs. Such was the force of this political economy that the Indian corn or maize brought into Ireland by the government was brought there not primarily as food to be eaten immediately by starving people, but as a gently applied economic lever. The government would only judiciously release Indian corn for sale from the government depots when it judged that prices on the general food market were rising too high. Thus, although Indian corn had been stored in the government depot at Cork, where the poor were starving, since January 1846, it wasn't until 2 months later that the first government sales took place.
Immediately on the depots being opened, the crowds of poor persons who gathered round were so turbulently inclined as to require the immediate interference of the police.
It was quickly judged that the market had been sufficiently regulated and supplies were suspended. This was in April 1846. It wasn't until a month later that the government ordered the opening of all depots for the sale of the Indian corn all over Ireland. By then, the poor were becoming desperate. Food carts carrying flour or Indian corn or wheat, oats and barley grown for rent, sometimes on their way to market or to the ports for export, were being attacked.
There have been attacks on flour mills in Clonmel by people whose bones protruded through the skin which covered them, staring through hollow eyes as if they'd just risen from their shrouds, crying out that they could no longer endure the extremity of their distress, and that they must take that food which they could not procure.
After all, food was there, plenty of it. Every sort of food except the potato was there because the harvest in every other crop but the potato was excellent. Food was leaving the country for exports in vast quantities. It was just not available to people who didn't have the money to pay for it. How then were they expected to get the money to pay for it? Well, the hinge on which all government policy at this stage turned was public works. That's to say, road building and other would-be local improvements subsidized by the local committees and the public purse. The trouble was that there was a great delay in starting these public works. The man in charge of all British government policy for the famine at this time was a British civil servant, Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan, permanent head of the Treasury, was an able, cultivated man, much given to reading his Bible.
Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God.
In his office, his principal concern at the moment was not the delay in starting the public works, but the fact that the depots now open selling Indian corn were selling it to people suffering from the distress normal to Ireland at this time of year, and not just to people in distress because of the potato failure. And he came to a severe decision.
Indiscriminate sales have brought the whole country on the depots, and without denying the existence of real and extensive distress, the numbers are beyond the power of the depots to cope with. They must therefore be closed down as soon as possible.
While hoping for a good new potato harvest in the autumn, the poor must do what they could on the market with such money as they could get from the promised public works. But where were these public works?
A boatload of flour and Indian meal, on its way from Limerick to Clare, was boarded by 14 armed men, held for 6 hours, and emptied of 100 sacks of flour and 20 of Indian meal. These people have hitherto been kept quiet by the promises that the government would every other day carry into operation the public works so often spoken of.
In the end, they did get going. Mostly the building of roads, some of which were necessary, others less so. Sometimes hills were to be lowered or hollows filled in. Anyway, by August 1846, there were 140,000 people able to earn some money, and that meant that with their dependents, about 700,000 people could get some sort of sustenance. But over 2 million people depended on the potato, and the potato had failed. So how were the rest, say 1.5 million, expected to survive? For a few, there were the workhouses. These had room for 100,000 altogether, and by law could only give relief to people actually inside them. The regime inside being made intentionally harsh as a precaution against scroungers. Harsh or not, by the summer of 1846, the workhouses were filling rapidly. But they could only take 100,000. So again, how were the other starving 1.5 million to survive? The government had always said that the main responsibility for relieving Irish distress should rest on the Irish landlords. Landlords who drew their often, but by no means always, wealthy livings from the rents of their tenants. So how were the landlords behaving? Very variably. In many districts, they were distributing charity to individuals and playing a most active part on the local committees, of which there were over 600 by the summer of 1846. Sometimes, too, they would give permission to their tenants to consume the crops they normally handed in for rent, and remit, or partly remit, the rent when they saw the extremes of distress at their own doors. Sometimes, as well as distributing gifts, they would start employment schemes of their own without waiting for the government's public works. The grateful tenants on this estate had clothing handed out to them for their children by the landlord's own small daughter. There were many such good landlords, but also many bad ones. Evictions of those tenants who could no longer pay their own rent became more and more frequent. Evictions carried out by bailiffs under the protection of police and military.
It was the most appalling sight I ever witnessed. Women, young and old, running wildly to and fro with small portions of their property to save it from the wreck. The screaming of the children and wild wailings of the mothers driven from home and shelter. In the first instance, the roofs and portions of the wall only were thrown down. But that Friday night, The wretched creatures pitched a few poles slantwise against the walls, covering them with thatch in order to procure shelter for the night. When this was perceived the next day, the bailiffs were dispatched with orders to pull down all the walls and root up the foundations in order to prevent the poor people from daring to take shelter amid the ruins.
Clearly, it was chancy, to say the least, to leave the fate of those now destitute from the potato failure largely in the hands of the Irish landlords. And yet this was exactly what the government was doing, closing those depots that still held food and ordering no more Indian corn for those that were empty. A new Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, came in the late summer of 1846. And with him came some hopes of perhaps a better new potato harvest. In expectation of this, Trevelyan wound up the public works and actually rejected a cargo of Indian corn on its way to Ireland.
The cargo of the Sorcière is not wanted. Her owners may dispose of it as they think proper.
And a few weeks later, as the first signs were already appearing that the new harvest too was blighted,
The only way to prevent the people from becoming habitually dependent on government is to bring operations to a close. Uncertainty about the new crop only makes this more necessary. Whatever may be done hereafter, these things must be stopped now, or you run the risk of paralyzing all private enterprise and having this country on you for an indefinite number of years.
Having this country on you for an indefinite number of years. Wasn't the whole point and argument of the union of Britain and Ireland that the two countries were indissolubly bound together, for better or for worse, for all eternity? That was what the 1801 union between Britain and Ireland was meant to be about. And there was no uncertainty about the new potato crop. It was a total failure. The lives of hundreds of thousands of poor men, women, and children were now at stake. With new desperation over the new potato failure in the air, even Trevelyan had to change his mind, and he reintroduced the public works. Only this time, the Treasury was to be spared expense, because most of the cost was to fall on the landlords through the local rates. Again, long delays in getting things started. When the new public works did begin, conditions were bleak and grim as Ireland headed into winter. But the clamour for work was universal. Those who could get it considered themselves lucky. The same sort of work as before: roads, the lowering of hills, the filling in of hollows, and the building of often unwanted harbours. Wages were kept purposely low so that only the really needy would apply. And what was worse, wages often weren't paid to the starving for days on end. There were food riots in Galway and Dungarvan, and cries of, "We want something to eat, we're starving."
The shops where meal and flour are sold have been crowded to excess. The people may be seen actually trampling upon each other in order to procure supplies. And the very young or the aged and infirm have frequently to return to homes miles distant without accomplishing their object in coming to town. On all sides, one cry is heard, the awful, piercing cry of famine.
The heart sickens at the sight of so many fellow creatures all but dead. Many, many, many are not able for work. They're so debilitated from want of food. I see hundreds of women and children going through the stubble fields, striving just to get an old stalk of potato.
The first deaths from starvation began to be reported in the newspapers. An inquest from the Cork Examiner, October 1846.
Inquest into the death of Jeremiah Hegarty. Mrs. Mary Driscoll. When did you last see your father alive?
On the Saturday, we had a little breakfast together. Some stirabout made from barley meal.
And how much of the stirabout did he have?
There are 9 of us in the family. There was about 3 pints of barley meal between us.
Did your father have any other food that day?
He had none. There was a little barley meal left over that I was keeping for him if he'd come back that night. Neither my mother nor myself would take any of it. We felt so sorry for him.
And what did your father have to eat the day before?
He had nothing. The rest of us had a few potatoes, but he would take none, so as to leave them for the children. They used to be crying of the hunger.
Thank you. Doctor, did you find any mark of violence or sign of disease on the body of the deceased?
I did not.
Well, what then was the cause of death, in your opinion?
I found the stomach and the intestines of the deceased totally devoid of food.
Thank you, Doctor. Gentlemen, what is your verdict as to the cause of death?
We find that Jeremiah Hegarty met his death for want of sufficient sustenance for many days before his decease, and that this want of sustenance was occasioned by his not having been paid his wages on the public works for 8 days previous to the time of his death.
Thank you.
Within weeks, there were to be hundreds like him. A priest wrote,
Deaths, I regret to say, innumerable from starvation are occurring daily. The bonds of society are almost dissolved. Parliament has made ample provisions for obviating these unparalleled evils, and yet they are suffered to continue. The pampered officials, appointed to carry into effect the merciful and just dispositions of the legislature, removed as they are from these scenes of heart-rending distress, can have no idea of them, and don't appear to give themselves much trouble about them. I ask them, in the name of humanity, is the state of society to continue? And who are responsible for these monstrous evils?
There was no doubt about that. The editor of the Cork Examiner wrote,
Talk of the power of England, her navy, her gold, her resources. Oh, yes, and her enlightened statesmen. While the broad fact is manifested that she cannot keep the children of her bosom from perishing with hunger. Perhaps, indeed, Irishmen may not aspire to the high dignity of belonging to the great family of the empire. They may be regarded as aliens. But when the Queen at her coronation swore to protect and defend her subjects, it's not recollected that in the words of the solemn covenant there was any exception made with regard to Ireland. How happens it then, while there's a shilling in the treasury, or even a jewel in the crown, that patient subjects are allowed to perish with hunger?
the workhouses were crammed to capacity. In Listow, 5,000 people attacked the workhouse, shouting, "Bread or blood."
Their bodies could scarcely be said to be clothed, and their pallid visages showed what ravages gaunt famine had already made upon their health and vigor. Heaven only knows when these things are to end, for it is to be feared We have yet scarcely seen even the beginning of the misery that awaits our unhappy people.
In our ears are the cries of the wretched people who hourly visit our houses with famine depicted on their hollow cheeks, praying in maddened accents of despair for something to eat. Deaths are now so prevalent that coffins are not to be had for half of those who expire from want, so that in many places the deceased are tied up in straw. The Galeen Relief Committee have devised a coffin with a slide bottom.
In this district, the poor are taken to the grave without any coffin and buried in their rags. In some instances, the rags are taken from the corpse to cover some still living body. Woe, want, and misery are fearfully depicted on the countenances of our people. Sorrow, suffering, and mute despair seem to have taken possession of their souls. Their feelings are blunted, their ideas confused, and their energies paralyzed.
The confusion of ideas, the paralysis of energies, were evidence of the fever, typhus, which, together with relapsing fever, both transmitted by lice, was now spreading throughout Ireland. Typhus is, in fact, the Greek word for mist, the confusion of the brain, which is a classic symptom of the disease.
I entered some of the hovels, and the scenes that presented themselves were such that no tongue or pen can contain the slightest idea of. In the first, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearance dead, lay huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering what seemed a ragged horsecloth, and their wretched legs hanging about, naked above the knee. I approached in horror and found by a low moan they were alive. They were in a fever. 4 children, a woman, and what had once been a man. In another hovel I found a woman sitting alone by the hearth. There was a pile of straw in the corner, under which were the mangled corpses of her 2 sons.
The fever was soon raging as an epidemic through the whole country, and did so throughout 1847, reaching even relatively well-fed towns like Belfast and Dublin. The reason for its spread is found in the name by which it was sometimes known, road fever. It was carried down the roads by people fleeing from the more stricken counties in the west.
Crowds of starving creatures flock in from the rural districts and take possession of some hall door or the outside of some public building, where they place a little straw and remain until they die.
The effects of the famine were now striking upwards in society. The casualty rate among priests and doctors was obviously high because they were in direct contact with the suffering poor, the dying and the dead. But at least when the upper classes died, they died in their beds, and at least their families could bury them properly.
The poor are dying in the fields, in the streets, in the ditches, on the roads and in the houses. some remaining for 4, 6, or 7 days without interment, without winding sheets.
6 months ago, this parish consisted of some 3,000 persons. Over 500 of them are now dead, 3/4 of them buried coffinless. They were carried to the churchyard, some on lids and ladders, more in baskets. Aye, and scores thrown by the nearest ditch, and there left to the mercy of the dogs, which have nothing else to feed on.
Mass graves scarred the countryside. In some ways, the dead were lucky.
A countryman, apparently almost deranged, entered a shop attended by a respectable female and asked for money. Not receiving it, he took from under his coat a dead child, which he cast upon the counter in desperation, telling her he was unable to procure a coffin for it, and immediately fled.
Horror succeeded horror. By the middle of 1847, deaths were accumulating faster and faster. It's impossible to gauge the exact number of dead at any given point in the famine. There were too many, and they were too humble for counting. But by now, many, many tens of thousands of the Irish people had died of starvation. Consciences were disturbed. The British public were financing charitable soup kitchens, the Quakers were admirably at work, and Queen Victoria herself had given £2,000, which is perhaps nearer £50,000 in today's money. But what actually was the government doing? Well, Trevelyan had reopened the government Indian corn depots. They were selling now to those who could afford to buy at market prices plus 5%. One of Trevelyan's officials asked him to make the prices lower.
If we lower prices, I repeat for the 100th time that we shall have the whole country in on us.
And as for actually giving anything to the starving, Trevelyan wrote,
If the Irish once find out that there are any circumstances in which they can get free government grants, we shall have a system of mendicancy such as the world never saw.
But that was what they already had. Eventually, even Trevelyan had to acknowledge that the principles of political economy were inadequate. A revolutionary change was undertaken in government policy, and for the first time it decided to distribute free food. The government itself financed soup kitchens and other basic free rations for the starving, and the costly and painful public works were to be wound up. In the interests of economy, though, the government relief works were very rapidly wound up, and the government subsidized soup and rations were very slow in appearing. A Protestant clergyman wrote,
80% of the work people have been dismissed, and yet they can't hope to be under the system of relief for 10 days yet. While the relief committee funds are expended, deaths are increasing tenfold.
In one part of County Mayo, in 18 days, only 4 days' rations were handed out. Even a temporary gap between the issue of rations and the closing of the public works brought an immediate rapid increase of deaths. But in the end, the new system of free rations began to take effect, with, by the middle of July 1847, over 3 million Irish adults and children receiving relief. And then, too, for the first time in 2 years, some more good news, so that people's hopes began to rise. The potato harvest of the autumn of 1847 was a sound one, without blight. Small, of course, because there'd been so few seed potatoes, but sound. Trevelyan's reaction, one might have guessed. He gladly seized his opportunity. All government relief under the Soup Kitchen Act would cease at the end of September 1847. At the same time, a new poor law was enacted, permitting workhouses on the local rates now to give relief to those outside as well as inside them. But could the local rates alone really finance all that was going to be needed?
At 6 o'clock this morning, 2 hookers arrived at our quay, loaded with 240 human spectres from Bearhaven, who had quitted their homes of wretchedness to find shelter in the workhouse. Here even, our misery does not terminate. The resources of this region are exhausted, and the establishment is in debt to a fearful amount. Let ministers no longer deceive themselves by vainly imagining that the local resources of any region in Ireland would be sufficient to maintain its poor. If they regard us as fellow subjects and wish to snatch us from the jaws of death, let them act without loss of time.
But unbelievable as it must now seem, English ministers had already done all they were ever going to do to deal with the Irish famine. Throwing responsibility for relief onto rates that couldn't be met and to the bankrupt poor law unions of Ireland was the last major positive step the government was to take. At Westminster, there'd been a growing conviction that all that could possibly be done for Ireland had been done, and that Ireland must now be left to what Trevelyan, in a terrifying phrase, described as the operation of natural causes.
It is my opinion that too much has been done for the people. Under such treatment, the people have grown worse instead of better. We must now try what independent exertion can do.
As for himself, it was time he took a rest.
After 2 years of such continuous hard work as I have never had in my life.
He went off with his family for a fortnight's holiday in France. In the Limerick workhouse alone, deaths were running at over 130 a week. Dying was one way out of the nightmare, but there was another: emigration. And thus began the great mass emigration from Ireland of the famine years. In the course of 1847, some 250,000 Irish men, women and children left Ireland, and the rate was to continue at that level and sometimes higher for the next 4 years. A mass emigration which was not only to alter permanently the population structure of Ireland, but in concentrating the seeds of Irish bitterness towards English government in the separate, rich and powerful nation across the Atlantic, the United States, to affect profoundly the future development of Irish nationalist feeling. Many of the poorest, in fact, never got beyond the English port to which they sailed. By mid-May 1847, there were over 100,000 Irish wandering, begging and destitute about the streets of Liverpool and other towns of the north of England. But by then it was by no means only the poorest who were emigrating. Not that emigration always enabled them to escape from horror or even death. Conditions on board the emigrant ships were sometimes as appalling as anything in Ireland.
Loose Talk, Liverpool, Quebec. 348 passengers, 117 died at sea. Larch, Sligo, Montreal. 440 passengers, 108 died at sea. The Virginus, Liverpool, Quebec. 476 passengers, 158 died at sea.
In addition, of course, there were the normal perils of a sea voyage across the Atlantic at the time. Some of the ships trying to cash in on the immigrant trade were not as seaworthy as they should have been. Though about 75% of the Irish emigrants went to the United States, and most of them to New York, it was Canada, and particularly the green island called Grosse Isle off Quebec in the St. Lawrence River, that saw the worst of the horrors. One eyewitness, watching boats bringing the sick and the dead from ship to shore, described how hundreds were literally flung on the beach, left amid the mud and the stones to crawl on the dry land as they could, while another, watching them as they crawled, said they were dying like fish out of water. In Ireland itself, the autumn and winter of 1847-8 were as bad as anything the country had yet experienced, with evictions increasing and corpses lying unburied even in a town like Limerick for days on end. Deaths in cabins, in roofless hovels tumbled by evicting bailiffs, deaths on the roads, in workhouses, in fever hospitals, in jails, in ditches. Even in the kinder weather of June 1848, one inspector of roads near Clifton in County Galway had to bury 140 corpses he found scattered along his route, while a man from the same district, up on a charge of sheep stealing, was saved from imprisonment by being able to state in open court that his wife, maddened by hunger, had been driven to eat the flesh of her own dead daughter. But even worse was still to come. To an Ireland already reeling under 3 successive years of famine came the final blow. News that the new potato crop was almost totally blighted. The year to come was to be the most terrible of all.
Of the 6,000 souls still alive here in Skibbereen, more than 1,000 have at present scarcely a morsel to put in their mouths. No firing, hardly any clothing, huts worse than pigsties for those lucky to have any at all. The rest exist under large rocks in the sides of cliffs. They subsist on seaweed, mussels, the green leaves of turnips, and the small stunted turnips left in the ground after the crop has been removed.
Exports of food from Cork on one day, Tuesday the 14th of November 1848. 147 bales of bacon, 5 casks of hams, 300 head of cattle, 239 sheep, 9,398 firkins of butter, 542 boxes of eggs, 1,996 sacks of oats.
Dublin, 1st of February, 1849. The Lady Mayoress's ball. The extensive suite of apartments in the mansion house were thrown open last night to receive the guests of the Lady Mayoress to a grand ball and supper. Dancing continued with uninterrupted enjoyment till an advanced hour of the night, and refreshments of a most recherche description were supplied with inexhaustible profusion.
Ballinrobe, County Galway. We have dead bodies everywhere. Every village has dead bodies lying unburied for many days. Almost every hovel has its corpse. May God forgive our rulers for this cruel conduct towards God's creatures here. The poor are dropping into their graves in multitudes.
To Lord John Russell, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. My lord, I have a right to speak, for I'm a minister of God. And so then, let me importune and implore you to stand in the breach between the living and the dead. Tell the assembled Parliament that the people, not any more, be left to die.
I do not think that any effort of this House would, in the present unfortunate state of Ireland, be capable of preventing the dreadful scenes of suffering and death that are now occurring in Ireland. I do not feel justified in asking this House for an additional advance of £100,000 that at least would be necessary if this House should say that there should be no possible cause of starvation in Ireland.
Ballinrobe, County Galway. The streets are daily thronged with moving skeletons. The fields are strewn with dead. The curse of Russell, more terrible than the curse of Cromwell, is upon us.
Deaths in the workhouse of Ballinasloe, County Galway, total population about 5,000, for the week ending 28th of April 1849, 226. For the week ending 5th of May 1849, 490. Charles Trevelyan, recently knighted for his labours, had been busy writing a history of the famine. He made it end in August 1847. But now, in 1849, over 18 months later, the Dublin Freeman's Journal was saying,
We again ask, is it not possible to contrive some means of saving the people from this painful and lingering process of death from starvation? Do we live under a regular or responsible government? Is there justice or humanity in the world that such things could be in the middle of the 19th century? And within 12 hours' reach of the opulence, grandeur, and power of a court and capital, the first upon the earth.
Such was the question that Irishmen were to continue to ask themselves for many, many years to come. And it was the inescapable answer to that question which, among other later influences, was to lead them, in the end, towards an inescapable political conclusion. That Ireland should in the future run her own affairs. For nothing could ever quite efface the memory of this monstrous thing that had happened in these years to Irish men, women and children in their own country in the name of British government in Ireland. The population of Ireland in 1845 had been about 8.5 million. As an immediate result of the famine, about 1.5 million people emigrated from Ireland. And perhaps as many as 1 million died.
Margaret O'Brien, Daniel Flaherty, Andrew Keane, John Folan, Michael Walsh, Mary Commons,